Welcome to a very special week of Kodsnack. It's Øredev debrief week. During this year's Øredev, I had the opportunity to do a short on-stage chat with each of the 5 keynote speakers. And this week, you get to hear the results. Today, we have my interview with Monika, who was also the first keynote speaker. Tomorrow, we have Galit. Natosha is on Wednesday, Cyrus on Thursday, and we wrap up with Diana on Friday. And as usual, links to each speaker and their presentations will be in the show notes, along with anything else we might have mentioned. And if you have heard the presentations, you'll have some more context. But you could also see our chats as a really good appetizer for the full thing. So, for this first interview, a little bit of context is useful if you haven't seen the keynote yet, or other talks by Monika for that matter. She's just talked about challenging the classic futuristic worldview of utopia on one side and dystopia on the other, and talked about how they are two sides of the same coin and sort of mutually interconnected. The whole idea is sort of stuck in the past and generally leads to bad outcomes. And protopia, which is a concept we briefly mention as we talk, is a different approach where you don't get stuck on those grandiose visions and you refuse to see things as a zero-sum game and instead in general try to find better and more grounded, really, ways forward. Better ways than rambling manifestos which sound generated by ChatGPT, and better ways than thinking that cyberpunk is something you should actually strive for, rather than a warning about the future that might come. Anyway, enough of my rambling. Enjoy the interview and the week. Welcome to the podcast stage, Monika.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
And we've just watched your great keynote here. And for everyone listening later, it will be linked in the show notes, as always. We were coming out of the keynote, and you said one of the things I like the most. Oh, I have all these other things that I didn't have time for that I would like to talk about. So I would love to hear what some of those things are. Yeah, what was the first thing you listed? You listed like 3 or 4.
So I spoke broadly about the importance of disability in creating the kind of innovation that does not universally benefit all humanity, because nothing does, but it benefits humanity significantly more than, in fact, the kind of technological innovation that is motivated by the needs of military-industrial, surveillance state, or police state complex.
Yeah.
But I kind of spoke about disability broadly, and unfortunately today still, the way we adjust our architectural designs, technological designs, we think of disability needs as mostly accessibility needs, as in physical access, wheelchair access, hard of hearing, hard of seeing, deaf, blind access. And we do not take into account other sort of a little bit harder to define disabilities, such as in a physical disability realm, people being immunocompromised, chronic pain issues, as well as neurodivergence. I can speak most competently about neurodivergence-related issues as it pertains to autism, ADHD, and complex PTSD, because that's been my experience, even if I dealt with other stuff at other times. Similarly, with physical disability, I've experienced being in a wheelchair, experienced certain health conditions that really showed me how broken our social structures and physical infrastructures are when it comes to disability integration. But yeah, I think people are really unaware how informing with disabled people's perspectives and putting disabled people in a position of leadership, not designing for, but really designing with them, and ideally really bringing forth the leadership of the most impacted, allows us to create the kind of innovation, the kind of technological tools, mediums, platforms, as well as also physical infrastructures, physical buildings, urban design that ends up benefiting much more than those select groups. In part because any of us could experience disability and neurodivergence within certain contexts of life. None of us are ever prevented to experiencing that, unless, again, we die a sudden death, and then we are gone completely. But also because there are really interesting overlaps, right? When we talk about disability-led innovation within, let's say, transportation hub design, airport design. Somebody like me who has sensory hypersensitivity and sensory-related issues, I don't need to have had an intercontinental flight. Or I don't need to be extremely exhausted to deal with fairly complex and intense sensory issues. But somebody who has just flew red-eye, let's say from Los Angeles to Doha, and now is changing their flight to go to Sydney, Australia, the experience might start approximating mine because of the fatigue. People that are cancer patients, often also experience sensory-related issues with sound, smell, light, that are quite similar to people that have autism and people that have ADHD and stuff like that. And we know how many of our loved ones already have cancer or have gone through a cancer journey throughout our lives. So what really, really interests me right now is to work on more projects where more than just basic accessibility needs that are given, wheelchair access, hard of hearing, hard of seeing access should just be the default mode that we have. And we know that even with that, right, like the curb cuts that initially were done for wheelchairs end up benefiting people that have, carrying something with the wheels, like suitcases and stuff like that, for mothers or parents that have their children in the strollers, to the bikers, to so many people with other sort of mobility needs. At the same time, sometimes we can try to do our very best, but if we do not really consider, again, everybody that is impacted, even with our best intentions, we can create certain issues. So the curb cuts made it more dangerous for hard of seeing and blind people to move. And so then what we needed to integrate is this texture on the curb cuts that still supports people with certain mobility needs, but also doesn't exclude blind people. Right? So I think for me, these are really, really interesting considerations, and we really do not speak enough how so much of a technological innovation. I mean, email. I mean, you could argue that, maybe to some of us, email has made our lives more difficult, but I don't know if we'd want to go to the time before emails. And the creator of email was hard of hearing, and his wife was deaf. And they couldn't communicate with the phone. So they invented email. So much of the other technology that we take for granted, from voice assistants to screen readers to audiobooks, to being able to dim, enlarge, font on a screen or any kind of visual on a screen. These are all disability adaptations, subtitles. And, subtitles don't just help to deaf people. That people could say, well, that's a small population. It ends up helping everybody to whom any given language is their non-native language. So there are always more people that could benefit from that kind of innovation, whereas if we compare it with, again, innovation that gets brought into the world by military-industrial complex, it could still benefit some people, especially the very wealthy people, or people, whose country got it. I mean, what we need is to also reckon with complexity, right? I'm somebody that has always been against militarization, against military-industrial complex, but when your country gets invaded, you also understand that some of those technologies are necessary. However, all of our innovation funding should not be funneled through this particular bias. And so, I mean, personally, neurodivergence is so interesting for me because that's something that I have dealt with my entire life. And yet there were very few words around, and there was very little understanding and a really profound stigma. And yet today I realize how, from my very earliest involvement with computational space and user experience and user interface design, and when it comes to VR, AR, XR, I was looking at it from a neurodivergent lens, right? As a person with sensory issues, I'm very aware when something comes too close, too aggressively, too violently into my field of view, or also when sonically something could come in a sort of creepy or aggressive or that kind of way.
Sneaking up behind.
Exactly. Sort of. And that is very similar to a lot of other people that have experienced violent sexual assault or physical assault or any kind of other, sort of assault or violence-related trauma. And so that led me to always think, well, how do these interfaces not just pop out, but approach you in a way that doesn't trigger fear response, that doesn't make you close down, that doesn't, turn on sort of that bodily anxiety responses? How do we create digital spaces that do not just reproduce a physical space, but actually learn from the best ways that we could be designing safe, compassionate, welcoming physical spaces, and then amplify that because in a digital space we're not bound by gravity. So there's so much stuff like that. And really going back to that airport example, yes, for autistic people and people experiencing chronic pain issues or immunocompromised people, of course we would love to have spaces in our airports where you could recline easier, where you could sit on softer, not just harder surfaces, where it'd be possible to avoid hyper-scented environments, where we could have at least a certain amount of sonic reduction, ability to control the light, etc., etc. And I can tell you for a fact, if those spaces were available not just to people traveling first class, non-disabled, non-immunocompromised, non-neurodivergent people would also benefit from them and welcome them and want to hang out with those parts of the airports.
Yeah, you can have a comfortable seat, you can control the light, and there's not that much noise in an airport. I mean, that's that's luxury.
It's a dream for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Yet at the same time, it's very hard to push a lot of that kind of reglementation for the general populations. And so general populations could actually rely on us being at that bleeding edge of harm so that we could create spaces that would be better for general populations too. And so the reason that people still don't understand that really, really puzzles me.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking as a software developer, I at first I thought that's kind of funny, but it's really kind of depressing because we sort of profess ourselves to we love iteration, we love constant improvement, but we're not doing enough of this stuff either. And someone comes up and, you need a select box. I'll just build my own, it's perfect. Or you could use the one that people are actually improving.
Well, and I think it's obviously lack of knowledge and lack of curiosity that results from it. For me, it's just been such an extraordinary process of learning from other neurodivergent people and other disabled people and how they approach different problems and how do I approach problems. And also, how can then I adapt my life in a way that I'm not living in this continuous state of exhaustion and violence with the physical environment. Yeah. So let's say there's also super, super interesting overlaps between blindism, blind people and autistic people, as well as some deaf people and autistic people. And the other day at a dinner, I was talking with one of the developers attending here who is deaf in one ear. And what we realized when we communicate and we really struggle with too much of a noisy background around us. I also have vocal cord issues, so my voice runs out. But I am a fully hearing person. However, because of my sensory issues, it's like all the sound reaches me, but it's all tangled up. Yeah. And my mind has to consciously disentangle that. Yeah. And so for that reason, I am observing somebody's mouth as they pronounce the word very similarly how a hard of hearing person does.
Oh, yeah.
Because it really helps me to then disentangle those strands of sound. And, when we are learning from each other, when we think of what kind of architectural spaces, what kind of design furniture spaces, what kind of interfaces and technological tools could help us with that, it's such an amazing conversation. Yeah. We come from very different backgrounds. We have very different lived experience. And yet together, we are finding better solutions for not just both of us, but that could be adapted by so many other people.
Yeah.
And so that curiosity, that desire to not just be right and say that my way is the only way, but that together we can learn, and that nobody is born into knowing.
No.
And to be born, into a non-bigoted environment, not an environment that excludes entire groups of people, is also a form of privilege.
Yeah, of course.
So I really would love to invite more people to embrace learning rather than just being right, because unfortunately we've been doing that too long, and see how that worked out.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that came up watching your keynote, like the protopia principles and the inspiration, the hopeful part that some people missed. It shouldn't feel so new.
Well, I know that some of my peers and colleagues in the realm of futures and foresights make much better money than me, because they always sell people onto this better future, and that here's the technological answer, here are the technological trends that you could latch onto, and just sort of we can just shove under the rug the underlying issues.
Yeah.
And I think that just doesn't work, neither in a form of consulting, nor in a form of policy, nor in a form of doing talks or workshops. It's important to put people on the edge of their seats to understand not just what is the problem that we face, what could be the worst kind of consequences to our actions in the present moment, but to also understand, well, how do we get here? Not just what kind of actions led us to this present moment, but what kind of belief system, what kind of ideology, what kind of imagination led us to this moment. Because only if we know that, we'll learn how to break that pattern. Only if we're able to make people understand, what is at stake, that you can then motivate them to do things differently. And so for me, we need to think of it simultaneously. What do we say no to? What do we understand as harmful, but how do we not stop with that despair?
Yeah.
How do we also, work on these future visions that are infused with informed hope, not wishful thinking, not just optimism, somebody else is going to do it for us, but informed hope, meaning we know how things have been done and we need to challenge the status quo, and this is how we're going to do it. And still, when I a lot of the times after my talks, people say, well, so what are the corporate applications? Now, how do we, we love these ideas, but how do I now apply it to the corporate? And my answer to that, well, there is no universal answer. That's when we need to go deep into this contextual situation. Which realm of the corporate? What is the context? Who are the people that we're dealing with? What are the goals, et cetera, et cetera? And we need to really start questioning these sort of universal answers and universal panaceas, because nothing is universal. And when we start applying the ideas, they always need to be adapted contextually.
Yeah.
And we always need to understand that there's never just like one baddie or one goodie, and the baddie can do no good and the goodie can do no wrong, right? That multiple agents have agency, that there are people, there are organizations that are benefiting from the harmful state of affairs. How do we take that into account? And yet, how do we make something that is better also successful?
Yeah.
Because if we don't succeed that, if it's just moral motivation, unfortunately we know that in the world as it is, people then we just stick with existing options.
Yeah. And I guess, more context, being more contextual, that makes the motivation part easier, because then you can find motivation in your actual context rather than, in this general world you should be doing this. Yeah, but what does it mean for me down here?
100%. And it's also, I keep insisting on that, not designing for, but designing with. Really making sure that you're not just doing like a short sort of excursion into the lives of the people impacted, but that you are in a continuous conversation. And knowing that, yes, you will be challenged, yes, you will be made uncomfortable, but that is the most precious kind of gift because it is a gift of learning.
Yeah.
Because if you are not learning, are you even living? If
Yeah.
you just stay, and this is what is just so mind-boggling to think about. In my talk today, I sort of brought together in this kind of in one paragraph the words of Marinetti, who was Italian poet, artist, the founder of Futurism, but also a co-author of Futurist Manifesto. And 100 years on now, techno-billionaire Mark Andreessen and his Techno-Optimist Manifesto. And it literally feels like it's been written by a chatbot that sucked in everything that Marinetti said and just translated into a tech bro language of 2023.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the degree of derivativeness, and this is a degree of frustration that I experience that it's been 100 years and we are still stuck with that imagination. Yeah. And so much of the popular science fiction, unfortunately, today, and I'm talking about mainstream formats, mainstream movies, TV series, and stuff like that, because, of course, in literature, there are a lot of exceptions to that. It is still stuck in the scientific worldview that was de facto in mid-20th at the very latest, late 20th century, not the 21st century understanding.
Not even, no.
The notion of, mind uploading and living forever and colonizing the entire universe, and still retaining our humanity, or not creating even increasing degrees of harm that we already have. I mean, we know that this is not possible.
No.
So why do we keep sticking our heads and our imagination in this outdated data?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a lack of imagination, I guess, really. The only thing I can do is look at Marinetti and say more faster and sort of shout. And I don't know.
And subdue nature.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This is literally multiple millennia old ideas. Subdue nature, rather than what we understand right now. We are nature.
Yeah.
And look how the subduing worked out for us.
Yeah, and that was really fun for me as well. It tied back to Øredev a couple of years back, when they were also talking about AI and the potential of superintelligence and all that stuff. And there were some talks by biologists, and they were not impressed with the ideas, shall we say, because they were also talking about, we are part of nature, of Earth, of the whole ecosystem. We're not separable from that. We don't even know if we can have intelligence, whatever that is, without the physical body and the chemistry and, the pleasure and all the positive sides you talked about as well.
Well, and what's so interesting as well is, finally, with more of a discourse, we're starting to retire words such as primitive to define indigenous cultures, how we're starting to retire words such as handicap to, or special needs or something like that, or lots of other ableist terms. But it's like we needed to wait all the way until the Western scientific method proves us that, yes, soil health is really, really important, and so many of these things is something that indigenous people, that disabled people have known forever, and yet their knowledge was not being valued.
Yeah.
And their knowledge that was scientific as well, because it came from profound observation.
Yeah.
Maybe not all of it was possible to be tested with the scientific instruments as we know, yet it came from profound observation. And I think, that is something that we still have a very profound misunderstanding when it comes to science and the history of science, that we think that it's always been objective. But it hasn't been. I mean, when we study the history of science, we understand that scientific research, just as technological development, has always been culturally motivated. It always followed the priorities of people that assured the funding. And oftentimes it tried to, it asked the question without wanting to hear the true answer. It asked the question because it already had an answer in mind and tried to, fondle the data, not just manipulate, but really fondle the data to a point where it proves that answer. And that's never how we learn.
No.
Similarly to this idea of just wanting to be right. Like, unless you are open to be wrong and open to hear an experience that is not unlike yours, you won't evolve, you won't change. And right now we need to hear not just the voices of other people, but also voices of this planet.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's easy to start thinking that, this is so big and complex. This is more than I can do day to day. But really what you're saying is go out and talk to some more people that you haven't met before.
Well, and this is where I find our education system is profoundly broken. Mm-hmm. And what we're facing with disinformation warfare, with hybrid warfare, with certain profoundly destructive entities, terrorist organizations, nation states benefiting from increasing amounts of ignorance and division. The purpose of propaganda is not just to make you believe the most extreme things. It targets certain people that are capable of believing, of being directed towards the greatest forms of extremism. But there's also a whole chunk of population that might not go to these extremisms. So what you do with that population is to make them overwhelmed, to make them feel, well, there's nothing that you can fully believe, that there's nothing that is reality, so that ultimately you end up disengaging. And instead of seeing that, yes, I can't change the entire world, but with whatever that I'm doing, I am, in fact, creating towards the future.
Yeah.
Everything that we do, when we get a good night's sleep, when we make ourselves a breakfast, when we share some new learning, when we read a book, we are creating a future, generally not just for us, but also for those around us. And needless to say, we do that with whatever that we work every day.
Yeah.
And so the only way to address the already dire state of impact of disinformation warfare and hybrid warfare is not just with banning the most nefarious sources. Sometimes that is necessary. I think there's always a blurry boundary between freedom of speech and freedom of hate speech. Yeah. And people that idolize freedom of speech, even of hate speech, are the kind of people like Mark Andreessen that have never suffered the consequences of their own ideologies. They only benefited from them. They've never been at the receiving end of them. But the only way to truly fundamentally address that is with education. Yeah. With historical literacy, with the present-day literacy, and with future literacy. And not just for kids. No. Not just in primary schools, not just in high schools, not just in universities, but throughout our lives. Because we know some of the majority of the elderly population that engages with technology, in fact, falls for disinformation much easier because they're not native to these mediums. And so we need to render accessibility to fundamental knowledge, how our bodies work, how climate works, how biosphere functions, what is the history of science, of medicine, of technology, what are the current developments, beyond just inflammatory headlines. Accessible, available for citizens of this planet, across social groups, across ages, and make people curious of that more than they are curious today to succumb to conspiracy wormholes on YouTube and stuff like that. Yeah. So we have valuable lessons. We have valuable lessons with the entertainment business. We have valuable lessons within gaming industry. We have valuable lessons in how creators of conspiracy theories and the profiteers of conspiracy theories succeed in rendering people obsessively, pathologically curious of that. Yeah. And how now we make people curious not about aliens or superintelligence, but of how AI can be used as a tool. Yeah. of what is the future of food systems, of what is the future of healthcare, and how do we make it accessible, sustainable, and ideally regenerative on a planetary scale.
Yeah. Need more good education and more good information in the systems, so to speak.
100%. And it also needs to be cool, right?
Yeah.
It needs to be cool. It needs to be sexy. It needs to be captivating. It needs to be beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's where I find when people talk about beauty, about aesthetics, about visual language as something superfluous, as something as vapid, as something as vain, we are making a fundamental mistake. Because there's all these smart people gathering in universities, gathering in think tanks, working on SDGs, etc., and all that then results in is very complex language, policy frameworks, post-its on the walls, and it does not translate into narrative and visual stories that, I don't know if you have a kid, but your kid or your nephew and my grandma could find just as interesting and appealing and accessible, not maybe to the same degree as a scientist working in that particular area, but still understandable.
Yeah, it's accessibility. It's connecting to the world around you, being part of the world, how you present the messages. It makes so much sense when you say it, but it's so easy to, I wrote this great white paper. If everyone just read it the way it is.
Well, and this goes back to what I spoke about peace being the most protopian process.
Yeah.
As my friend, peer, colleague, Jenko Gorfinkel speaks about, learning being that protopian process. It's not an end state. We never arrive at a perfect future, and there's no vision of the future that is perfect.
No.
Because as we keep learning, we start realizing that when we repair certain harms, we realize that there was so much harm that we were not even aware of.
Yeah.
And that's not something to tell us, well, if we can't fix it all, then we should not even do it.
Yeah.
It's kind of when people say, well, we can't stop climate change, so then why are we doing anything? And it's like, well, there's a huge difference between climate impact with 1.5 degrees of warming or 5 degrees of warming.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference between the climate impact where entire ecosystem within our ocean dies versus the one where, yes, certain parts might die off, but we might still have hope with time to regenerate them.
Yeah.
So all or nothing attitudes have never helped, and especially they are incredibly harmful when we talk about tenuous political issues, like, for example, what we have in the Middle East right now.
Yeah.
The most extremist parties always embrace attitudes of all or nothing. And in fact, these extremist parties, and especially extremist parties on the rightist wing of the spectrum, rightist not in the most correct, but the most fascist, though that rejoins with extreme forms of communism.
it wraps around.
History told us, Hitler and Stalin started the war together as allies, and only then got into their own fight. But they need each other. Extremists need each other because they are unable to maintain power in a time of peace. Because the time of peace is when we are able to render people accountable for their corruption, for their abuses, when we demand our lives to get better.
Yeah.
And so they create conflicts, they create wars, because that's what allows them to maintain an accountable power.
Yeah, like being on the extreme ends.
And it's much easier. Politics of fear is much easier. Dystopian storytelling is much easier than hopeful storytelling, especially if we talk about informed hope and not just wishy-washy hopeful, I'll just imagine and somehow we're going to magically leapfrog the problems that we're facing today.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's so much simpler, really. It's wonderful. Actually wonderful that we don't need bigger pie-in-the-sky solutions. We need to be more down here and do concrete things and figure things out as we go. And that's really what developers talk about as well. We just need to do it more.
Well, it's exactly that, right? I feel that's where futures literacy comes in a picture, because even when we do something small, we need to think of, well, what kind of world that is contributing towards.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to be able to do everything. And there might be some problems that seem to be bigger and more important. But this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm good at. So how, with whatever that I'm good at, I could create the best possible world. And how my piece of a puzzle could rejoin other pieces of the puzzle. And how, if we all have that shared motivation and we help each other to maintain the motivation. Because sometimes, indeed, the reality seems quite despairing. So when I feel the despair, you lift me up. When I feel the despair, when you feel despair, I lift you up. When you feel the despair, I'm getting confused.
We lift each other.
We lift each other up. That's much better, right? We lift each other up, and we keep working. And we understand that it's not a journey that will take a year. It's not a change that will take a decade. It's not even a journey that our lifetimes will suffice. The best that we can do is open the doors so that others could walk through them. Is to open the doors and inspire others to walk through them. And that being enough.
I think that's a wonderful point to end on.
Thank you so much.
Tack för att just du lyssnar på Kodsnack. Om du vill stödja oss, varför inte tipsa en bekant om podden? Eller lämna en recension i till exempel iTunes eller något annat ställe där det går att sätta betyg på poddar. Du kan också stödja oss genom att köpa oss en kopp kaffe på Coffee. ko-fi.com/kodsnack. Alla pengar går direkt till att göra podden bättre och trevligare. Du kan också komma och hänga i vår Slack-kanal. Länk finns på kodsnack.se, precis som alla andra länkar och all annan info kopplat till varje avsnitt. Sist men inte minst finns det också en länk till vår Spreadshop-butik där du kan köpa tröjor och andra prylar med kodsnacktryck. Återigen, tusen tack för att du lyssnar. Vi hörs.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.